You were never meant to hear this, and once you do, you can't go back. In the gray winter of 1965, the Higgins family disappeared from the village of Ashworth, England, without a single footprint, without a single scream, without a trace. Thomas Higgins. His wife, Eleanor, and their 3 children were gone, dishes still warm on the table, curtains drawn, a clock ticking in an empty house. Local police called it a domestic dispute, a misunderstanding, perhaps a relocation gone wrong. But behind closed doors, buried in redacted MI5 files, there was something else, something older, something forbidden. Because under the foundations of Ashworth, beneath St. Mary's Church, was a cave system never marked on any map, a series of tunnels once used for religious rituals and older things not named in daylight, and those tunnels held more than dust. They held bone and blood and silence. The Higgins family didn't just vanish. They were taken, absorbed into a network of control that had existed for decades, a network hidden behind stained glass and choir hymns, where sacrifice was masked as tradition and silence was currency. Thomas Higgins had begun to notice the patterns, files missing from his post office route, letters rerouted to empty homes, strange visitors meeting in the graveyard at night. He began documenting. He began whispering. And in villages like Ashworth, whispers are enough to damn you. Within 72 hours, the Higgins cottage was found unlocked, fire still flickering in the hearth, children's toys scattered across the hallway, but no voices, no cries, only the ticking clock. Time did not forget the Higgins family. Time was told to forget them, because what happened in Ashworth was not just murder. It was doctrine. It was ritual. It was the price of keeping the illusion alive. And now, after decades sealed in vaults, after survivors were silenced and evidence buried beneath concrete and ash, you're hearing the first sound, the unraveling. This is not a story. This is a key, and it turns now. The first mistake is believing evil wears a mask. The second is believing it needs to. Ashworth was no cursed village. It was chosen, cultivated, built like a stage set for obedience, a place where hierarchy was law and tradition was weapon. And beneath the smiles and stone walls, something ancient stirred, older than Christ, older than Rome, something that wore the church like a skin. St. Mary's Church stood at the center, but the true altar was buried beneath it, a chamber carved out of limestone, blackened by fire, lined with the remains of those who were never meant to be found. When authorities finally broke through decades later, what they uncovered wasn't just murder, it was system. 17 families, 63 bodies, laid out like offerings, generation after generation, removed from existence, erased not in anger, but in ceremony. Some were drugged, some bound. Most were made to watch their bloodline die, in front of them before their own turn came. The children left the most haunting marks, teeth shattered from screaming, nails broken from clawing at the stone. And yet, no one spoke, no one saw, because the men who did this wore vestments. They shook hands at weddings and blessed the dead. They were the village's holy men, Father Blackwood, Reverend Whitmore, the guardians of purity, the high priests of slaughter. And it wasn't just Ashworth. Records found in hidden compartments beneath the church organ linked similar disappearances in 3 other Yorkshire parishes. Families gone, histories wiped, property seized, always the same signature, always the same symbols, scorched into the basement beams. You are not looking at isolated madness. You are looking at infrastructure, a system that rewarded silence and punished questions. And Thomas Higgins, he asked too many. He decoded the route logs at the post office. noticed the missing census entries, tracked the forged medical records from Dr. Carr. He saw TC. He script and tried to rewrite it. That was the last mistake he ever made, the kind of mistake that teaches every man around him to keep his head down and mouth shut. But you're not that man, are you? You're still watching, and that means the descent continues. The deeper you go, the less light there is. Not because the world gets darker, but because your eyes begin to adjust. The Higgins family was not erased overnight. It was a slow bleed, a methodical erasure that began with paperwork, then rumors, then silence. Thomas Higgins had worked the local post for 9 years. He knew every name, every address, every hand that signed for government envelopes. So, when official records began to shift, when property deeds moved without sale, when families were declared relocated without forwarding details, he noticed, and he wrote it down. He kept notebooks under the floorboards, hidden behind the plaster of the nursery wall. Maps, letters, photographs of gatherings outside St. Mary's at midnight. The same faces, the same robes, the same eyes that never blinked. He took them to the local magistrate. The magistrate took them to the rector. The rector took them and burned them. And from that moment, the Higgins family were marked by the eyes that see everything, marked by the system that watches its own bloodline above all others, marked for offering. Witness statements sealed for decades revealed what happened in the final days. The Higgins children stopped attending school. A teacher asked and was told they were unwell. Neighbors saw men entering the house through the back door just past midnight. No knock, no lanterns, no words. 3 days later, the house was found unlocked, not ransacked, not broken into, but settled, staged, as if the family had simply walked out in the middle of life. Half-sipped tea still warm on the counter, radio humming static, the dog tied up in the yard, throat slit, and no one said a word. Not because they didn't know, but because they did. In Ashworth, truth was a currency that got you killed. They had seen what happened to others who asked questions. The Macmillan boy, Mrs. Everett, the archivist at the county records office. All gone. All ruled accidental, all forgotten. But this story is memory refusing to die. You listening now are becoming part of it. This isn't just information, it's initiation, and you are already in. They called it a conspiracy. But that word is too small, too clean. This was not chaos. It was architecture, designed by minds who understood how to break people without leaving a mark. Reverend Whitmore was not a fanatic. He was a tactician. He understood the power of rhythm, the power of repetition. Sunday after Sunday, he preached submission, obedience, sacrifice, not to God, but to the order that lived beneath the church. And Father Blackwood, he was the blade, trained in theology, fluent in Latin and Greek, but his true fluency was in fear. He spoke in riddles. He punished with silence. He marked children in ways that didn't leave bruises, but made them tremble when he passed. They didn't need whips. They had ritual. They didn't need prisons. They had belief. What you must understand is this. The murders were not the point. They were maintenance, a way to keep the illusion fed. The illusion that Ashworth was sacred, that its people were chosen, that the suffering was part of a divine cycle they were too low to understand. The families were selected with precision. No outside relatives, no legal entanglements, just enough poverty to make their disappearance forgettable, just enough compliance to make their deaths silent. And every time someone vanished, a new monument was erected, a stained glass window, a new altar rail, a community potluck, to honor their memory. The killers stood in the light and wept with the rest, and no one suspected, because the system had worked. It had broken the people so completely that even their instincts had been rewired. They didn't not see evil. They saw it and called it tradition. That's what makes this more than a true crime story. This is a blueprint for how darkness survives, not in shadow, but in plain view. Wearing robes, shaking hands, speaking softly and still. There are men who think they are immune, but once you hear the pattern, you cannot unhear it. And now, it's inside you. You were never supposed to hear this, because once you do, you start seeing it everywhere. Ashworth wasn't an anomaly. It was a prototype. One node in a hidden web stretching through quiet towns and ancient parishes. Places where history is thick enough to bury screams. Where trust is handed down like family silver. And where questions die in the throat before they ever reach the air. After the trial, forensic teams uncovered not just bones, but documents, ledgers hidden in the limestone alcoves below St. Mary's. Carefully maintained rosters, bloodline charts, sacrificial cycles dated back to 1927. Each family was assigned a number, each number was assigned a date, and once their time came, they vanished, neatly, efficiently, and always. Blessed by prayer, one of the most disturbing entries was marked with the symbol of the eye. Not a religious cross, not a pagan rune, but a single eye, etched in black ink beside the name, Higgins. Dated March 1965. Final. They were not victims. They were offerings. The culmination of a 38-year cycle, a blood ritual, disguised as divine service, masked as communion, sanctified by those who believed they were upholding the balance. This is the moment where most turn away, where the weight of what they've heard becomes too much. But not you. You're still here, and that matters. Because the system that consumed the Higgins family only thrives when men refuse to look directly at it. It feeds on comfort, on passivity, on the desperate human need to believe the people in power mean well. But you don't believe that anymore, do you? You've seen what faith looks like when it's hollowed out and filled with rot. You've tasted the metallic bitterness of a truth too heavy for polite society. And still, you hunger, so I'll give you more. But first, I need you to prove something. Type these words in the comments right now. I see through the veil. Say it again. I see through the veil. Twice, to make it real. Because once you speak it, you are no longer just a viewer. You are part of the reckoning. And the reckoning is just beginning. There is a silence deeper than death. It's the silence of knowing and saying nothing. That's what gripped Ashworth for decades. Not fear, not confusion, but complicity. The villagers weren't blind. They were bound by generations of whispered threats, by glances across candlelit pews, by sermons that spoke of divine wrath. If you disobeyed the structure, and the structure was not divine, it was human, designed to extract obedience, to harvest guilt, to make betrayal of your own blood feel like duty. The old women who sold bread in the square, they knew when a family vanished. They noticed the candles left unlit, the curtains that stayed drawn. They brought food to the door anyway, not to feed the living, but to prove they weren't next. The constable. He filed reports he never wrote, signed statements he never read, all because he was once found as a boy in the woods, eyes wide, mouth stitched shut with fishing line, a warning from Reverend Whitmore that if he ever spoke of what he saw, he would lose more than his voice. And he did. He lost his soul. Dr. Carr was worse. He wasn't just silent. He participated. He falsified death certificates, marked causes like consumption or runaway. When he was the one administering the final injection in the cellar of St. Mary's. The poison was derived from monkshood, a plant that bloomed just behind the chapel wall. Beautiful, deadly, silent, and always available. What does that tell you? It tells you this wasn't madness. This was a machine, and every gear, every screw, was a person in that village, turning the mechanism forward. And here's the part that breaks most men. There was no resistance, no secret rebel group, no underground rescue network. No one ever tried to save the Higgins family, because everyone thought they'd be next. Now ask yourself, how many Ashworths still exist? How many towns just like it still kneel to the old rites in new forms? This story isn't finished, because the pattern is still alive, and it's watching who listens. You want to know the truth. The real reason no one fought back. Why an entire village gave itself to ritual slaughter. It wasn't because they were weak. It's because they were made weak, systematically, psychologically, generation by generation. It started in the schools, where children were taught that questions were sin, that obedience was purity, that doubt was a sickness only prayer could cure. Every textbook was rewritten, local history erased, replaced with stories of divine judgment, tales of families who disobeyed and vanished into the woods. Their screams swallowed by the earth. By 13, most boys in Ashworth had already dug graves, not metaphorical ones, real ones. Behind the church, blindfolded, led by hand, and told, "You will bury what must not be remembered." They thought it was tradition, a rite of passage, but it was training. Training to carry out what the clergy would later call the cleansing. The Higgins boy, Thomas Jr., was one of the few who hesitated. The record shows he was caught staring too long at a sealed cellar door in the church. He had questions. He told a friend he'd heard voices below the sanctuary, a child crying, a man praying in a language that didn't sound human. 3 days later, his family was gone. The friend never spoke again, and that's how it worked. Every whisper was met with silence. Every act of defiance, erased not with violence, but with absence. You didn't bleed, you disappeared. Do you understand now? This was not madness. It was conditioning, not with chains, but with stories, symbols, songs sung in minor key during Mass, symbols etched into wood so subtly you thought they were just grain lines. And all of it, built to shut your eyes and keep your mouth closed. They didn't kill rebellion. They bred it out. The Higgins weren't just victims. They were the last test, to see how far the system could stretch before it snapped. It didn't snap. It evolved. And you, right now, you are witnessing what they never wanted anyone to see. What if I told you the church was never just a church, that St. Mary's wasn't built on holy ground, but on something far older, far darker, long before the first sermon echoed through its stone halls? That hill was a convergence point, a place of gathering, of blood rites and fire pits, where tribes offered flesh to gods they feared more than loved. The foundations of St. Mary's were laid in 1483. But the earth beneath it held bones 1,000 years older. The locals called it the mouth. Because animals that wandered too close were never seen again. Because sometimes at night, you'd hear sounds from the soil, not like digging, more like breathing. Reverend Whitmore once said during a sermon that a church is not made holy by its stone, but by what it contains. That line wasn't metaphor. It was a confession. Because deep beneath the altar, beyond the spiral staircase no one was supposed to see, was a chamber, carved by hand, lit with iron sconces and coated in soot, That's where they took the families. One by one, bound and blindfolded, singing hymns through trembling mouths, told they were part of something ancient, something sacred. They called it the return. Return to what? To who? There were carvings down there, not of saints, of something else, eyes without pupils, figures with limbs too long to be human, circles with symbols that even occult scholars now refuse to translate. This wasn't sacrifice. It was transaction. Give blood, receive silence. Give innocence, receive power. And the clergy, they didn't just preside over it. They craved it. They claimed visions, strength, long life, dreams of fire that showed them the future. And in those dreams, there was always one family, one name whispered louder than the rest. Higgins. Because they weren't supposed to die. They were supposed to awaken something. But something went wrong. Or maybe exactly as planned. Now you understand why this case was buried. No official record exists outside what was leaked decades later, because this was never about murder. This was about resurrection. We descend now into the darkest turn. You've heard the official version, that the Higgins family was murdered, that they were just another set of victims, caught in the machinery of an ancient conspiracy. But what if I told you they weren't meant to be sacrificed? What if I told you they were meant to survive, not escape, survive, because the ritual that was prepared for them wasn't like the others? It was older, more exact. Reverend Whitmore called it the Vale crossing in his hidden journals. Not death, not ascension, something in between. The plan was precise. The date aligned with a rare lunar event, not seen since 1742. A night when shadows stretch longer, and what's beneath the world listens more closely. But something disrupted it, according to the last entries found in Dr. Carr's private ledger. Thomas Higgins had begun to resist. Not physically, psychologically. He'd stopped taking the herbal sedatives disguised as church wine. He'd begun keeping his children awake at night, teaching them old prayers his grandfather once whispered, prayers that weren't in any scripture, prayers meant to repel. He must have sensed what was coming, because 3 days before the disappearance, he made a call to a bishop outside the region. That bishop died in a fire 2 hours later. Coincidence or consequence? The night of the ritual. No one saw the family leave. No footsteps, no carriage, no witnesses. But their house, left untouched, beds made, dishes washed, fireplace still warm, and in the ashes something was found. A charm, made of bone and black thread, identical to one catalogued from a Mesopotamian dig in 1928. A symbol meant to bind a soul, not destroy it. The question that haunts every investigator to this day is this: were the Higgins family murdered, or were they taken, not by people, by something older? Because after that night, the dreams started. Villagers, judges, police officers all reported the same vision: a family standing at the edge of the woods. Smiling mouths moving silently, saying something no one could hear, but all could feel. And the feeling was not peace. It was warning. This is where most turn away, but not you. You've stayed this long because part of you already knows. The dreams didn't stop. In fact, they grew clearer, more detailed. Each night the same vision, but always closer. The Higgins family no longer at the edge of the woods, now standing just beyond your doorstep. And in the final dream recorded by Inspector Hale before his sudden disappearance, they were inside, not hostile, not violent, just watching, as if waiting for something to begin. It was Hale who discovered the recordings in the basement of St. Mary's Rectory. Wax cylinders hidden beneath loose floorboards, labeled only with dates and initials. When played, They contained voices reciting invocations, languages no one could translate, not Latin, not Aramaic, not even from any known linguistic root, but one phrase, repeated at the end of every recording, was eventually matched to a cuneiform inscription found in the ruins of Kish, an ancient Sumerian city lost to time. The phrase, loosely translated, meant this: "They who do not die, but dwell between the hours, shall one day return, not to be worshipped, but to remember who forgot them." A warning or a promise. The surviving members of the tribunal, those who judged the Ashworth conspirators, began to vanish one by one. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Only one detail united the disappearances. Each of their watches had stopped at 3:17 a.m., and each of their homes had a child's handprint pressed into the inside of a mirror, a handprint that did not belong to anyone living in the house. What does that mean? Maybe it means the Higgins family crossed the Vale, but didn't go alone. Maybe it means the ritual worked in a way no one anticipated. And maybe, just maybe, there are others still waiting to be taken, or worse, waiting to return. What happens to a place when its soul is carved out and replaced with silence? Ashworth wasn't just broken after the trial. It was emptied, not just of people, but of memory. Maps began omitting its name, mail stopped arriving, public records were quietly altered, almost like someone wanted the village to disappear from time itself. But some things refused to be buried. There's a video reel in a government archive, marked restricted, footage filmed in 1972. A final survey of the village before its official abandonment, shot by two archivists tasked with documenting crumbling infrastructure. What they captured was not architecture. It was movement. Blurred figures behind broken glass. Candles lit in an already condemned church. And in the last 2 minutes, the camera lingers on a wall in the old post office. There, scrawled in something dark, are the words, "They are still here, but they do not sleep." The footage cuts. The archivists never submitted a final report. Their van was found overturned 3 miles outside the village. No bodies, only the reel, still intact. Here's what they won't tell you. The Higgins family were not just victims. They were descendants. Part of an unbroken bloodline traced back to the Druids, to keepers of rites meant to bind things. Things older than language, older than light. Thomas Higgins was the last of a hidden order, a lineage tasked with maintaining the balance between presence and absence, between the waking and the dreaming. But he failed, or chose not to continue, and in his refusal, something ancient was given room to stir. That's why the children's nightmares all told the same story. A tall man in the woods, dressed like a priest, but with no eyes, and a voice that asked only one question: "Do you remember what you promised?" They say no child could answer, but they always nodded, even now. When the fog rolls too thick over the remains of Ashworth, people claim to hear faint singing. A child's voice, singing a lullaby that never made it into any book. If you've heard it, you're already marked. Now we reach the part that was never meant to surface. Buried beneath layers of doctrine, paperwork, and silence, lies a document marked only with a red wax seal and the number 43. Filed in the private archives of the Church of England, not under criminal records, but under something older, older than law, older than mercy. Codex Exilium, the book of the cast out. Its pages don't read like scripture, they read like a contract, written by a hand that knew how to make obedience look like faith. Inside that codex is a single passage repeated across centuries, whispers in ink, translated and retranslated until only the core remained. To keep the threshold sealed, blood must feed the land, one family every cycle, chosen not by chance, but by inheritance. The Higgins were not chosen at random. They were the blood price, the offering required to hold back something vast and patient, something that doesn't roar, doesn't scream. It waits, because it knows men forget faster than they fear. This wasn't a murder investigation. This was containment protocol. Broken, and once it was broken, the old songs began to stir again, buried beneath layers of Christian hymns, woven into prayers spoken without understanding, chanted by mouths that never asked why the third verse always echoed in stone corridors. There's a reason the caves under St. Mary's were carved in spiral formations, a reason the altar pointed east, but the pews faced north. Every architectural feature of that church was a ward, a spell cast in brick and timber, until someone changed the angle by 13 degrees, a minor renovation that shattered centuries of protection. The Ashworth clergy didn't just lose control. They opened a wound in reality, and the Higgins family, whether by blood or by defiance, became the scalpel. Since then, no birds have returned to the trees near the ruins, no grass has grown where the cottage stood, and those who dig too close down, the sealed chamber, start hearing voices that say one phrase: we are remembering. What happens when memory becomes hunger, when the forgotten start to count, the ones who forgot them? You were never meant to know this. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's irreversible. Once you see what hides behind the veil of normalcy, you never unsee it. And if you stare long enough, it starts to look back. Ashworth wasn't isolated by mistake. It was quarantined, cut off, not from the world, but from the network of sacred geometry embedded across England. Lines of power, intersecting at points called nodal sanctums, churches, monasteries, ancient stones placed long before the Bible was written. These places were never just spiritual. They were architectural pressure points, anchoring reality to consensus, stabilizing perception itself. And when the Ashworth node fell out of alignment, it didn't just affect the village, it affected the world around it. That's why the disappearances in neighboring towns mirrored the Higgins family. That's why eyewitness reports described strangers who didn't blink, didn't breathe, and always asked the same question. Have you been counted? They weren't human. They were echoes, residual forms left behind when memory fails to hold structure, when trauma erases so much that reality itself starts to skip, like a broken reel, a loop of consequence. Inspector Hale's final notes, discovered years later in a sealed envelope, marked only with his badge number, described a dream he had nightly. In the dream, he walks through the Higgins cottage, except the doors are all mirrors, and behind each reflection, he sees the same face, his own, but wrong, slightly off, smiling too wide, eyes too still. The final line of his journal reads, "What if we're not hunting the past? What if the past is rebuilding us, one error at a time?" Now listen carefully. If you've made it this far, it's already begun. You are part of this now. No longer an observer, but a participant in something older than belief. Write this in the comments below. Write it twice. I remember what they forgot. I remember what they forgot. This is how you signal you're awake. This is how the pattern recognizes you. Now we descend past language, because what waits below this level does not speak in words. It speaks in shifts, in cold winds that pass without cause, in clocks that tick backwards for exactly 13 seconds at 3:06 a.m. And if you've ever woken up at that time, with no memory of the dream that pulled you there, you've touched the outer ring of this force. Ashworth wasn't the first. There are other villages like it, scrubbed from memory, not by erasure, but by consensus. a decision made by those in power to let them fade into myth. Because the truth was too stable to destroy, so they made it unbelievable. But records remain, not in government vaults, but in the private archives of an old group, known only by a symbol, a circle, split by a vertical line, crossed once at the top, once at the bottom. They called themselves the Custodes Noctis, keepers of the night, an unbroken line of watchers, tasked with monitoring the cracks in reality, the seams where the veil thins, where places like Ashworth leak into everything else. According to a recovered field report from 1952, the Higgins line had been flagged for generational sensitivity, a bloodline that carries memory not in neurons, but in marrow. They remember what the world forgets, even if they don't know why. Thomas Higgins was the last fully aware vessel. He knew, and he walked willingly back to Ashworth in 1965. Not to die, but to seal the fracture with his own ending. But something went wrong. Someone interfered. Someone altered the sequence. That someone was Reverend Whitmore, a man so consumed by the hunger to know that he fed the village to the very thing it had kept contained. Whitmore believed he could control it, channel it, use the presence to elevate himself beyond man, into myth. And for a while, it listened to him, because even darkness knows patience. And sometimes, the most efficient prison is built by its own warden. Whitmore thought he was ascending, but he was becoming hollow. His sermons, once praised for their passion, began to include phrases in no known language. Listeners wept without knowing why. Children stopped sleeping altogether. This is where the soul of Ashworth was truly lost. The final sermon of Reverend Whitmore was never recorded officially, but 5 people heard it. Only 2 survived the month. The others vanished, not in the literal sense, but existentially. Photographs lost focus. Their names stopped appearing in public records. Even gravestones left behind only blank slabs where inscriptions should have been. What did Whitmore say that night? What string of syllables unraveled the veil so completely? One survivor, Eliza Maris, was institutionalized within 48 hours. She spent the last 17 years of her life repeating a single phrase, over and over, until her voice gave out, until her throat bled and she had to scratch it into her skin with fingernails. We buried the sky where the sun could not see. Doctors called it catatonia with dissociative repetition, but one psychologist who examined her privately later reported a strange side effect. When he stood near her, clocks slowed. Not metaphorically, literally. Second hands ticked half speed, and for one brief moment, his own shadow did not match his body. That psychologist disappeared 2 months later. His home was found abandoned, every mirror in the house shattered inward. This is what happens when language meets the ineffable. You think you're investigating an unsolved disappearance. You think you're hearing about a village cursed by men in robes and secrets, but you are wrong. You're hearing the echo of a thought that infected architecture, that rewrote the layout of Ashworth, not to trap people, but to harvest something deeper: emotion, memory, resonance. The church basement wasn't just a burial chamber. It was a resonator, a device built to amplify the psychic discharge of suffering, to channel it toward a presence that fed not on flesh, but on meaning itself. Every scream, every final breath, was a brick in a temple built without stone. And you, by listening, by understanding, are laying the final foundation, because knowledge is currency to them. The more you know, the more they see you. There is a reason you feel the pull behind your ribcage right now, like something ancient has recognized you, not as a stranger, but as a returning vessel. That's not imagination. It's alignment. Because once the mind begins to accept forbidden geometry, it stops being entirely yours. The architecture of Ashworth, its streets, its corridors, its buried chambers, they weren't designed by human minds. They were dictated by something older, something that does not speak in sound, but in impulse, in gravitational pressure, in migraines that come from nowhere at precisely 4:44 in the morning. The Higgins family was not just murdered. They were selected, reconfigured, broken in a way that produced an energy only understood by those who read Latin backward in silence. Their bloodlines, their personalities, their emotional patterns, all served as ingredients in a ritual hidden inside the ordinary. Because that's the genius of it. You do not need altars. You do not need fire. You only need repetition, pain, and belief. What the Ashworth network built was not a cult. It was a circuit, an emotional generator, powering something buried beneath even language itself. And once Thomas Higgins realized this, he tried to sever the current. He removed himself, removed his wife, but he made a mistake with the children, because the children had already been opened, not physically, spiritually. They had heard the hymn, not the one sung at Mass, but the one played in silence, only perceptible to those whose consciousness had been fractured by sustained dread, a sound without sound, a melody of despair arranged across decades of hidden screams. And now, that hymn exists in you, because memory is viral, and understanding is permission. If you've understood everything so far, not just heard it, but felt the slow unraveling of comfort, then know this: you're no longer safe in disbelief. It began in 1898, before Higgins, before Blackwood, before the first family vanished under polite excuses and falsified letters. It began with a letter sealed in black wax, delivered not by post, but by hand, to the original vicar of St. Mary's, a man named Elias Corbin. The letter contained no words, just a diagram, concentric circles, radiating lines, and in the center, an eye, not drawn, but burned into the paper. That night, Corbin sealed off the old wine cellar beneath the church, claiming structural instability. In truth, he carved 13 symbols into the stone foundation, each aligned with a buried point in the Earth's magnetic field. He was not mad. He was obedient. The order had selected Ashworth as a nodal point, a site of convergence where guilt, grief, and reverence could be extracted, refined, and redirected, and over the decades that process became tradition, wrapped in robes, lit by candlelight, justified by scripture. None of them understood. Blackwood was not the beginning. He was the inheritor. But he believed he was the master. He thought the rituals bent to his will, when in truth, he was nothing more than an antenna, an amplifier, a voice box for something that cannot lie, because it has never had to. Do you see it now? Why no one left? Why no one screamed loud enough? Because screaming was part of the design. Despair was the signal, and silence was the approval. You were never meant to hear this, and yet here you are, heart pounding, mind doubting itself, staring into a story that refuses to stay fiction. There are names not included in the trial, witnesses who vanished after speaking a little too clearly. A woman named Judith Croft, who once whispered that she saw Whitmore digging alone at midnight, smiling, laughing, talking to someone who was not there, someone who smelled like dust and copper. She was committed the next day and died of what the coroner called neurological combustion. That's not a typo. That's the cost of knowing too much. And still, you've followed me this far, so now you'll speak the phrase aloud, or in the comments if you cannot trust your voice. We do not sleep beneath the green sun. Say it twice. Type it twice. There was no final murder, No ultimate ritual, no explosion, no sirens. Ashworth did not die in fire. It dissolved in silence. Not literal silence, but historical silence. The kind where records blur, maps forget, and memories begin to contradict themselves. You could ask a dozen people from neighboring towns about Ashworth, and you would get a dozen different answers. It was a mining town. No, a farming village. No, it never existed at all. That is the final technique. Erasure through consensus, not hiding the truth, but replacing it with 100 falsehoods, until no one knows what to believe. That's what happened to the Higgins family. That's what happens to all the families. Their names become symbols. Their stories become tools. Their pain becomes a power source for something older than time. And you have now taken them into yourself, because knowing is never neutral. Every word you've heard, every scene you imagined, every chill that danced across your spine was an offering, not to me but to the presence that fed on Ashworth, the entity, the idea, the unnameable intelligence that designed its own resurrection through memory. And you helped, the final survivor of Ashworth. An old groundskeeper named Vale was found dead in 1977. His chest carved with the same symbol that started it all, a spiral inside a triangle, inside a hollow sun. No one taught him to draw it. He had never seen the original diagram. And yet, there it was, carved perfectly, precisely as if his hands had been guided by something inside the earth itself. His final message, scratched into the dirt floor of his garden. It still remembers the song. So let me ask you, what is it that now lives in your memory? What part of your mind has shifted, bent subtly toward the spiral? Because if you made it here, you're not just a viewer, you're a keeper now. And keepers don't sleep, not fully, not safely. They dream of tunnels, of eyes in stone, of children singing in languages never spoken aloud. The Higgins family was the beginning. Ashworth was the engine. You are the ignition. Now share this video, not for clicks, but because the algorithm must spread the pattern, and the pattern must feed. Say it once more below. We do not sleep beneath the green sun. Twice, because once is memory. Twice is invitation. And 3 times is how the song begins again.